Hi class, Professor Seeger here. In this video, I will be going over a couple of ways sound devices are significant in poems and can even help create meaning. I will also go over a couple of poetic terms or effects related to sound and the subtle effects they have on the reader. It is best that you are familiar with the figurative language lecture before you proceed with this one. So please, remove yourself from all distractions. Make sure you have a pen and a pad of paper to take notes during the presentation. And as always, if I go too quickly, please feel free to stop and rewind as often as you need to. Cheers! Elements of sound are often the most difficult things to analyze in a poem. Typically, if students do bring up elements of sound in a paper, they might identify alliteration in a poem and move on, or note the rhyme scheme, but neglect to discuss why it matters. Remember, most analysis papers avoid discussing the sounds of poetry and do just fine. However, if you are able to identify and discuss the effects of elements of sound in a poem, you will be able to show a more subtle and sophisticated understanding of poetry, and it opens up any poem to another layer of meaning. English teachers are usually impressed with that kind of stuff. Poetry and music have quite a bit in common. Most contemporary music has lyrics with many poetic elements. When you look up the lyrics to one of your favorite songs online, you'll notice quickly that those lyrics are presented as poetry, with line breaks and other poetic elements like meter, metaphor, and personification. It's no accident that the words to songs are called lyrics. Both poetry and music are meant to be experienced and heard. However, unlike songs, poems must carry their music and rhythm completely inside the words the poet chooses. Sure, the music of poetry is a bit more subtle than a face-melting guitar solo, but it is still a powerful element in any poem. The rhythm is the backbeat, the sounds are the melody, all of it adds up to the music of a poem. Ideally, the images, subject, and theme of the poem are connected to that soundtrack and add up to an overall experience of language and meaning. Since poems are meant to be heard aloud, the sound must be important, right? Right. What sound does the rain make? Onomatopoeia is when a word imitates the sound that word makes, just like in the word raindrop. But when we think about it, there are numerous different sounds for rain, in nature and in literature. Some of the variety depends on the type of rain and what it lands on. However, another large part has to do with the speaker's attitude towards the rain. This can reveal a lot about a speaker. It can also hint at themes or the tone of a work of literature. However, those sounds, in part, are also up to the listener. Typically, literature is a collaboration between the author and the reader in order to create meaning. So interpretation of these sorts of sounds are often a balance between a reader's personal experience and the cultural and literary context of the sound. Words aren't just sounds, though. It is certainly more important to know the meaning of words. Understanding the effects of sound, however, does add to our emotional and physical understanding of language and our experience of it. Sounds evoke a mood, create an atmosphere, and can even convey emotions. Sounds surround us and are representative of other things. Even silence gives us information. Typically, sounds either reinforce and deepen the emotion of a situation, or they work to contrast it. Remember, sounds and rhythms might be worth discussing, but they aren't the most important parts of a poem. They work with the most important parts, which are the words and images the poet selects to express those ideas, feelings, and histories. Poems are concerned with conveying things which are difficult to convey: emotions, moments, images, feelings, etc. All of these things work together with other elements like theme, diction, and figurative language. They lend to our experience of a poem, but don't form it by themselves. When elements of sound stick out as significant to how you, as a reader, experience or understand a poem, then you have to talk about them, and it's important to know the right words. Sounds in poetry take the form of rhythm, rhyme, and repetition. These patterns of sound inherent in the words chosen by the poet create a sort of soundtrack, an additional level of meaning and an oral experience of language. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds in words. It can be initial, at the beginning of words, internal, within the words themselves, or hidden, typically only made evident when the poem is read aloud. The effect of this repetition all depends on the sound that is being repeated. In Robert Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays, there is a significant repetition of a K sound. This is not accidental. What is the effect of the repeating K sound in relation to the meaning and atmosphere of the poem? In what ways does the sound mimic the meanings in words like cracked? The K sound seems to create a harshness, perhaps to reflect the brutal sharpness of the morning cold and the coldness of the father. It also imitates the crackle of a fire starting. This is a form of imagery and scene setting. However, the harshness of the cold also reflects the coldness of the son and father towards each other. The fact that this harsh coldness resides in the language and contrasts the father's actions suggests various things about the emotional complexity of the speaker's memory. On the other hand, the repetition of S sounds could be either soothing or hypnotizing. Either way, alliteration shows readers new connections between words that share sounds. Assonance is similar to alliteration, except it refers to vowel sounds. Again, we are looking for connections and emotional effect. But keep in mind that most of the emotional effects of alliteration and assonance depend on the particular sound, how long it is extended, and its context in the poem. Of course, vowels tend to have a different sound and feel and significance than consonants have. In general, vowels tend to sound softer, but that isn't always the case. The best advice I can give you when reading for repeated sounds is to read a poem aloud attentively and ask questions. What might an O sound do for the tone of a poem? Is that O long or short? It makes a difference. It is up to you as the reader and analyzer to reveal what that difference is. Listen to this line as I read it aloud. Late August was a pressure drop, rain, a sob in the body. Can you hear the drop repeating in sob and body? It has a subtle effect of deflating or depressing the reader. What becomes amazing is when we associate the sadness with sob and attach it to the word body. We take the emotional and apply it to the physical. Euphony is when a passage of poetry has a pleasing sound, usually signified by soft, round sounds. However, there may be soft, plosive sounds like the P in the following passage from Christina Rossetti. When I am dead, my dearest, sing no sad songs for me. Plant thou no roses at my head, nor shady cypress tree. Euphonous passages avoid sharp or harsh sounds and typically signal a pleasant or beautiful moment. The fact that this passage depicts an author's death seems to contrast the pleasing sounds of the passage. Cacophony, on the other hand, is when a series of sounds create a discordant or grating experience. This is typically achieved by hard consonants such as G's, K's, and T's. Consider this passage from Milton. Grate on their scrannel pipes of wretched straw. I don't know what a scrannel pipe is, but from the cacophony I know I don't want one. Cacophonous sounds typically signify danger, conflict, or disharmony. It is true that identifying euphony and cacophony is not an exact science. Everyone hears sounds differently, but one thing to remember with either euphony or cacophony is that if you are writing about it, the passage you identify should be a fairly dramatic example. And of course, you absolutely must discuss and justify why those sounds are important to your experience and how it connects to other elements of the poem. Many readers struggle with discussing elements of repeated sounds. Part of this is because to examine elements of sound, like alliteration and assonance and onomatopoeia, you must also reflect on how the passage affects you emotionally. Remember, when analyzing elements of sound especially, you must allow yourself an emotional reaction, which may very well be subtle. Reflect on that emotional reaction and connect it to a larger meaning in the poem. It's good practice in poetry analysis and life to apply logic and meaning to emotional reactions. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. This is the end of Part 1 of the Sound as Meaning lecture. Please proceed to Part 2. Beep! Hello class, Professor Seeger here. Welcome to Part 2 of the Sound as Meaning lecture, where I'll be discussing how to discuss rhythm and meter. At this point, please remove yourself from distractions and grab a pen and paper to take notes. You know the rest. Salute! Essentially, rhythm is the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables throughout the poem. All poems, all speech has some sort of rhythm. It may be choppy or inconsistent, but there will always be a sort of rhythm. Think about drum beats or the tempo of songs. Meter, however, is when poems adhere to a regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. However, most poems will not strictly adhere to a single type of meter. But let's start with discussing the effects of rhythm. Rhythm is produced by a series of recurrences, a drum beat, typing keys, stepping feet. But there is a rhythm to works and sounds as well, especially in poetry. Some of that rhythm is the result of repeated sounds, like the repeated B in the phrase big baby bottle. But most rhythm in poetry is the result of stresses or accents on syllables in words. A stress or accent on a syllable has to do with whether we emphasize it or not, and it can get confusing because of the differences in how we each speak. But we can usually identify the stresses in words with some consistency. There are even markers poets use to scan a word or phrase. Scansion is the word for marking all the stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem. Here's a mnemonic device that helps. An unstressed syllable mark looks like a hammock, while a stressed syllable mark looks like someone's hair standing on end. Most words have stresses. Some don't. Prepositions like at, by, for, and articles like a, and, the don't really get stressed when we speak, unless we want to make a point. It takes a little practice, but you can start hearing it in your speech patterns. Beat of the heart. Curve in the road. Pause the video and read the white quoted passage aloud. Can you hear the rhythm of it? How would you mark or scan these words? Now listen to me read it. Rhythms are inherent in the motions of the moon and stars, even though, when they move, we hear no sound. How many different ways can you say this without sounding over the top? Where did you stumble the first time you read through? Consider these stumbles as information about the stresses and rhythms of a passage. Scanning a poem for meter is when we pay special attention to its rhythm by marking the stress value of each syllable. Why do we do this? We bother to scan poems in order to identify their meter and rhythms, to better analyze the subtle effects they have on the reader. These patterns are important to the experience of the poem, and sometimes even its meaning. Meter uses a basic measure in poetry called the foot, which is 2 and sometimes 3 syllables long. Of all the various poetic feet, the most common is the iamb. The iamb is like a foot rolling from heel to toe, heel toe, heel toe, heel toe. In fact, the word iamb means foot. The heel is the unstressed, the toe is the stressed. So not only does the iamb imitate the way we walk, but it also most closely approximates our English speech patterns. What that means is that we tend to most often speak in iambs without even knowing it. Robert Frost was said to often compose poems in his head while he walked through the woods to help him write in metrical verse. An entire line of poetry made up of iambs is called iambic. One way to remember the names of these poetic feet is that they tend to imitate the syllabic stresses that they represent. Anapest, trochee, spondy, all except the dactyl. Think of the dactyl as the joints of your finger. The first is long and the next two are shorter. When we look at meter, we often look for where the meter breaks or utilizes other feet. These changes maintain the reader's interest and point to significant changes in the poem content-wise. We might also see general patterns such as rising and falling meter. Rising meters move from unstressed to stressed syllables, which work to create tension. Falling meters move from stressed to unstressed, which helps to create a more relaxed tone. If you forget how they affect a poem, consider what happens when you go from being stressed to unstressed, or vice versa. The most traditional form of meter is pentameter, but there are many different sorts of lines. Each tends to have its own effect, again, depending on context. Typically, the longer the line is, the slower the reader moves through the poem, whereas the lines that are 1 or 2 feet read very quickly down the page, often running lines into one another grammatically, which is called enjambment. Therefore, longer lines are more likely to have a denser and more cerebral content, while shorter lines tend to create a more visceral or physical experience. Remember, longer lines mean more feet per line. There are several words for different line lengths, and if you have problems remembering the different lengths of line, Remember that the root words are Greek and work like mathematics. Sometimes in longer lines of poetry, authors want readers to pause midway through. Those pauses, marked by colons in the line below, are called caesuras. They're like rests in music. They set the pace of a line of poetry and can speed it up or slow it down to match the mood and tone. Consider the pauses in the following passage. Cover her face. Mine eyes dazzle. She died young. There's a bit of tension between each colon and what comes after. Notice that in the pause after the second colon that the reader dies a little, just as the young girl did. This is one way a poet might disrupt the meter of a poem. Typically, meters that are too strict tend to bore the reader and dull the subject matter. They are easy to scan, but also rhythmically predictable. Most rhythms are harder to scan. This is because everyone speaks a little differently due to different encounters with the English language. My parents were German immigrants who spoke broken English. That still affects the way I pronounce words today. On top of that, most poets work to deviate from even the most consistent meter, to make the poem rhythmically interesting and to highlight certain passages. This will be especially important to consider when looking at poems from other cultures. Understand, many sound patterns are obvious and fairly consistent between people who hear them. Bang, bang will always be two stresses. When we say these words aloud, we start finding the pattern of rhythm in individual words. Transformation, recurrences, and syllables. You will notice that often the longer the word, the more variation of rhythm is possible. Therefore, it is important to note that scanning a poem isn't an exact science. Much of it is up to the reader's ear. Some poems have very strong rhythms that can affect the tone and feel of the entire work. Rhythms can also add to the effect of a poem's music by slowing down and speeding up the language to mimic the movement of thought or emotion. In this poem by Derek Walcott, The Fist, consider how the rhythm changes throughout. How close to a formal meter is it? Also, keep in mind the beating of the heart. What happens when our hearts don't have a strong, regular beat? Notice the places where the meter changes. What might those changes suggest about the subject matter of a heart clenched in a fist? Where is the meter most regular? Where does it falter? Pause the video now and read it aloud. Do it. Now, what do you make of the rhythm in the last stanza? Does the long line suggest anything about the subject matter of the poem? Now, listen as I read the poem. What parts did you read differently? Why? The fist clenched round my heart loosens a little, and I gasp, brightness, but it tightens again. When have I ever not loved the pain of love? But this has moved past love to mania. This has the strong clench of the madman. This is gripping the ledge of unreason before plunging, howling into the abyss. Hold heart, then, heart. This way at least you live. Now as you read poems or listen to language in general, I want you to pay attention to its rhythm and meter. Consider how it subtly affects you, the message, and what larger themes you find most important. This is the end of Part 2 of the Sound is Meaning lecture. Please proceed to Part 3. Beep! One day, poet Alexander Pope wrote a long poem about the act of writing poetry entitled True Ease in Writing Comes from Art, Not Chance. In this poem he wrote, the sound must seem an echo to the sense. Basically, Pope is saying that in regards to poems and sound, form follows function. Patterns of sound in a poem create an effect beyond just the meaning of the words. A line or a poem has sound, just like a song has sound, and that sound, in the hands of a good writer, echoes the meaning. It used to be we could identify a poem by three things: line breaks, a form of meter, and a regular rhyme scheme. Today, however, some poems may just rhyme occasionally and don't really have a regular identifiable rhyme scheme. Some won't have a lick of rhyme. My point being, not every poem you read will require you to consider rhyme. But if a poem or poet chooses to create a pattern with rhyme, you should take the time to consider what that rhyme does or does not do for the poem. And you need the right words to discuss the effects. Rhymes are echoes that come in many forms. Not all poems utilize rhyme. Many modern critics and poets feel it is an unnatural way of speaking, or what one critic called a way of spoiling plain prose. Rhyme creates a rhythm of its own and has several effects and uses. We like rhymes. They help us remember things and create a pattern that we can appreciate and predict. The pattern of rhymes in a poem is called its rhyme scheme. These rhyme schemes vary from poem to poem, creating an effect that, like sound and rhythm, adds to the understanding of the poem. But there are other reasons for rhyme, and rhythm for that matter. The fact is that poetry existed before prose, and it came about for a reason. In fact, it existed even before written languages, so people composed in rhyme to more easily remember the work. Think back to the things that were read to you in childhood. Most of what you'll remember are simple poems that rhyme and teach us things. There are many ways to rhyme, and each shows a different relationship between the words being rhymed and the concepts those words imply. First, we have exact rhyme, which means that the vowel sound is the same in both rhyming words. Do we need to know that? No. We need to know that the sound's exactly the same. Bat, cat, hat, sat, fat. Letters, betters. Slant rhyme, near rhyme, off rhyme, all of these words are interchangeable. These types of rhymes have the same consonant sounds and different vowels. How can a rhyme sound different? Well, they're almost rhymes, like moved and loved, or like moaned and mourned, or even born and brawn. There is a common saying that there is no rhyme for the word orange. There are plenty of slant rhymes, like porridge, but they tend to leave the reader uneasy. They feel almost right. They are a sound relationship between words, but it's typically a dysfunctional relationship. When reading the Dickinson passage, notice the near rhyme between crumb and home. There is the echo of the round vowel in the M sound, although it rings a little hollow. There is the implication that perhaps this home isn't the comfort to the bird that it is to the speaker. It might start hinting at the strangeness of trying to domesticate wild animals. There are dozens of other uneasy connections you could make between these words, but remember that the first step is noticing the connection between these words. The fact that the poem is full of exact rhymes also draws attention to this one slant rhyme passage. Consonance is the proper term for a specific kind of slant rhyme that occurs when the rhymed words have the same consonants, get it, but different vowels. Pitter-patter, drip, drop. And as for the difference between masculine and feminine rhymes, it has to do with which syllables in the rhyming words are accented. The masculine accents the end syllable in both words, while the feminine accents the second to last syllable, softening the rhyme just a little. These divisions, however, often seem to be more for the sake of identification, and it becomes difficult to analyze its significance to the larger context of the poem. This brings up an important point. In a formal paper, don't identify an element of the poem, sound or otherwise, unless you are able to discuss its significance to a larger theme or meaning. Sometimes it's nice to consider the location of the rhyme and why it matters. End rhymes come at the end of a line of poetry. The rhymes tend to be heavier and more obvious at the end of a line. Consider the passage from The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. These strong end rhymes show connections and relationships between entire lines of poetry. End rhymes tend to give readers a sense of completeness. People like it when things rhyme. This is why it is very important to consider its general effect on the tone. Heavy end rhymes, or short rhyming lines, often create a lighter, whimsical tone. What is it that keeps The Raven from being a light or whimsical poem? Or is it a light and whimsical poem? Internal rhymes occur somewhere in the middle of the line, or across two lines. They are sometimes less obvious on the page, but seem very clear when they are read aloud, as in the passage I just read from The Raven. Internal rhymes create an echo effect, and often show a connection between individual words more than entire lines of a poem. It might also be a way to divide a longer line of poetry, as in The Raven. Consider, what does the internal line do to the pacing of the poem? How is it different from an end rhyme? Do the lines with internal rhyme read faster or slower? You may have heard someone say that a poem has an AB-AB rhyme scheme. That means that in the poem's first 4 lines, the end word of the first and third rhyme together, as do the second and fourth. Let's look at Shakespeare's 12th sonnet. If we were to scan and mark each line of the poem for rhyme scheme, it would typically look like this: AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. Remember, when scanning the rhyme scheme of a poem, make sure to scan the entire poem. Don't end with the first stanza because sometimes authors change the rhyme pattern or abandon rhyme schemes altogether. Remember, there is a reason for this. Shakespeare's 12th sonnet has a very specific type of rhyme scheme which identifies it as an Elizabethan sonnet. Notice that there is a shift in the last 2 lines that would signify a thematic, rhetorical, or tonal change. However, what I notice most is the strange rhyme between herd and beard. Why is there a slight catch in the smooth naturalness of the rhyme scheme? What does that suggest about what the poem refers to in these lines in regards to the rest of the poem? We notice these things in the poems, and then we start asking questions. The better questions we ask, the more interesting the answers we come up with might be. Of course, all elements of sound are working to create a feeling and a mood for the reader. Rhyming, of course, often lends to this mood, as we have discussed. However, typically rhymes work in a couple ways. 1. They show us connections and relationships between words that we might not have previously considered. 2. They show a form of completeness or rightness to a connection. This is why sappy love songs rhyme the word love with heaven above, and not with push and shove. When lines rhyme, the reader tends to feel happy and complete, like all is right with the world. And when rhymes are rather obvious or simple, they create a childlike tone. Now, poets can use this childlike tone to devastating effect. Just take a look at the passages by Shel Silverstein and Sylvia Plath. Both use a nursery rhyme tone and sensibility, but to dramatically different effects. So to sum up, remember to be inquisitive and always ask questions. Start generally with questions like, how does that poem sound? What does that sound do for the poem in terms of my experience? What does the sound do to help me understand the poem? Then, as we get a feel for the poem, we can start honing in on specific effects and elements of sound like meter or alliteration or slant rhyme. But remember, basic questions will be the same. Does the sound echo the sense, or is it doing something surprising and strange? And always remember, look for the effects of the element of sound on the reader emotionally and what other elements and themes it highlights. Once you start examining the various elements of sound in poetry, you not only open new dimensions to any poem, but you will also wake up to the subtle effects different encounters with language have on all of us, whether they are an advertisement for a new phone, a presidential address, or just a heartfelt discussion with a friend.